Hello. So today we're going to talk about medieval letter forms and book formats. Illustrations and schematic images such as maps, charts, diagrams began to be used to configure and disseminate certain kinds of knowledge and information. Although when we think about the Middle Ages, we always have to remember that power over what was going to be given to the people to read was still centered in the church. So when we think about this time frame, especially about the different kinds of documents and their cultural value, what we have to remember is that it was very carefully decided what was going to be made into a book and how it was going to be made and who could read and who couldn't read. Most of the people during the Middle Ages were illiterate, and they were dependent on the priests, the scribes, the monks to be able to give them the information that was actually in these texts. Before the invention of mechanical writing, books were handmade objects. So they were treasured. They were beautiful works of art, and they were symbols of this enduring kind of knowledge and very, very sacred. So in the Middle Ages, the book becomes sort of an attribute or a gift from God. And so we see these beautiful covers and kind of crazy like attention to detail to these amazing Bible forms. The type of material that was used inside of the book to print on or to hand letter was parchment. Parchment came from the skin of a calf, a sheep, a goat, and it was specially prepared and thinned and dried in a particular way, and then it was cut and it was used to write onto the text. So later on, we hear the term parchment, and that was because there was paper that was later mechanically made, and it was made as an imitation of these original animal skin type pages. Icon. This is a icon carved about 1000 in Constantinople. The setting is made before 1085. It was Spanish from a monastery of the Santa Cruz de los Cerros in Jaca. It's made with gilded silver on wood and inset with an ivory icon. And then around it, we see glass, crystal, and sapphires. So really quite beautiful. And it's 10.5 inches by 7.5 inches. In the early Middle Ages, before the rise of the universities and commerce, which were important to the growth of the printing industry down the road, monasteries were the only ones really for producing these books. In this particular version, this is a German image from the 12th century, and here it shows the monks as they were preparing the animal hides for the parchment, or often called vellum. They were writing, they were correcting, and they were illuminating the manuscripts. So that term vellum is another term for parchment. Again, calfskin, lambskin, kidskin, used for the quote, in parentheses, paper and binding of the books. The type of letter style that we're going to see throughout most of these books in the early period is called majuscule. It's characterized by rounded and all capital letters. It's used from the 4th to the 8th centuries. So an illuminated manuscript in which the text is supplemented by the addition of decoration. That's how we would define it. Such decorated initials, borders, often called marginalia, and miniature illustrations, we see them in great detail. So here's a good example of that, and notice that all the letters are capitalized. In the strictest definition of the term, an illuminated manuscript only originally referred to manuscripts that were using gold or silver leaf. So they would powder the gold and mix it with a binder, and they would literally kind of paint it on to the manuscript, and it would illuminate. It was bright. It was both common usage, and then later on, when we get to modern scholarship, we start to see the term change a little bit, and now it refers to pretty much any Bible or book from that time frame that was illustrated or decorated in any fashion in what we call the Western tradition. So this is one of the pages from the Lindisfarne Gospel from about 700. Unical is a type of majuscule script written entirely again in capital letter, commonly used from the 3rd to the 8th centuries, and it was used by both Latin and Greek scribes. We have to remember that these things were, they had a lifespan, and so as they would start to erode or become, um, decompose in any way, that they would have to be rewritten. And so that's why we see that they would be written either in Greek, Latin, or Gothic, depending on who was writing the manuscript or recopying it, if you will. So here's a version of Unical. Early Unical script is likely to have developed from Old Roman cursive. Early forms are characterized by broad single strokes letters using simple round forms, taking advantage of a new parchment and vellum surfaces, as opposed to angular multiple stroke letters, which are more suited for rougher surfaces like papyrus or Egyptian papyrus. So then that was what we saw in Rome, using this papyrus too. So here's another version of majuscule, a complete use of capital letters with very few ascender and descender. So ascender would be like the like in the cap, like a small h, like a lowercase h. It goes above the x line. Descender would be like a lowercase y going below the waist, the baseline. So in modern terms, it simply means capital. Another form that we see coming in between the 7th and 9th century is minuscule, and that, of course, relates to small cursive script that becomes developed from the uncial. So here's a version of that. Most of the time that was considered Carolinian or Caroline minuscule, and it was developed as a writing standard in Europe so that the Roman alphabet could then be easily recognized by other literate classes. So people that spoke different languages would be able to still understand exactly what they were reading in Latin or Greek or, Gothic. And so it was available from one region to another. It was used during Charlemagne's empire between approximately 800 and 1200. We see both codices, pagan and Christian texts, and then educational material, all written in Carolinian minuscule throughout the Carolinian Renaissance. The script developed into black letter and became obsolete through its revival in the Italian Renaissance. Forms were basically more recent scripts, definitely use that minuscule. So here's an example of some of the different forms from a book by William Mason's. It was called A History of Writing, and it implies sort of this evolution of the minuscule style of writing. And there you can kind of see how it moves from the capital letters all the way down. And then here's a really nice example of the alphabet pattern book from the 12th century. And there you can see the kind of serpentine or Celtic decorations or illustrations, and also some of the animal or beast-like illustrations within the letters and around the letters. And so one of the things I want you to think about here is very much that it happens in history is where sometimes the style of the people in a particular area will stay the same, even though the content changes. So the serpentine and Celtic kind of knotwork patterning and animal patterning that we see in the letters, that was originally pagan. And when much of the British Isles Christianity kind of comes through, especially in Ireland, and St. Patrick converts many of the Celts to Christianity, the letter forms don't change, the content changes. So now, instead of a pagan codice, we see a Christian codice, but in the same pagan originating letter forms. So very interesting stuff, but we see that over and over in ancient times. And here's kind of a close-up, so you can really see what I'm talking about. And there you can see, like, inside, there's this sort of tales and dragon-like experiences and these phoenix birds and different beasts in different places throughout the type. Really quite beautiful. Here's another Hippocrates, so science, a scientific form, and there we can see both minuscule and majuscule, upper and lower case. So a scribe would copy the text from an established edition. An artist might then embellish it with illustrations. So when the scribe would copy it, they would leave space for the artist. And the artist would often ornament it in the margins. And the most lavish medieval books were bound in covers that were set with jewels, enamels, ivory, and gold, and all kinds of other things, just like we saw early on. So many bookmakers in the Middle Ages were monks and scribes, and they lived in monasteries. And these monasteries often kept libraries that were filled not only with sacred texts, but also with literary, scientific, and philosophical works by ancient Greek and Roman authors. And that's one of the reasons why today we still have the works of Plato. So princes and emperors would commission these books. They would also commission gospel books with many colored illustrations and lettering in gold and silver ink, which of course then the term illumination came from. Multi-volume Bibles and huge liturgical books were housed and used in churches. And one thing you have to keep remembering is that every one of these were handmade. So in the 13th century and 14th century, private persons started to buy and use the books, and they would have these what were called books of hours, which contained prayers to be recited throughout the day. They were very popular. A book of hours was a devotional book popular in the Middle Ages. It is the most common type of surviving medieval illuminated manuscript because they were in people's homes and they took care of them and hung on to them. Like every manuscript, each manuscript book of hours is unique in one way or another, but most contain a similar collection of texts, prayers, and psalms, often with appropriate decoration for Christian devotion. Illumination or decoration in many of these books are minimal because they were bought by lay people, by everyday people, or maybe merchants, that kind of thing. But they often were restricted to decorated capital letters. But when we get to the wealthy patrons' books, those would be extremely lavish, full-page miniatures, full-page illustrations, really beautiful covers, and so on. Here's one with Christ's Majesty. Which brings us to the Book of Kells. So the Book of Kells is probably one of the most famous illustrated manuscripts in the world. It contains all four Gospels and preceded by each Gospel by a preface and a summary and a canon table of concordances of the Gospel passages. It is written on parchment or vellum and contains a Latin text of the Gospels in insular majuscule script, and it's accompanied by intricate, really magnificent whole pages of decoration with smaller painted decorations appearing throughout the text on almost every page. So it's an illuminated manuscript, again, gospel book in Latin, containing all four Gospels. It was created by Celtic monks around 800 Common Era, and maybe slightly earlier, started slightly earlier. We know it took quite a long time. This picture kind of shows where the gold illumination is. The manuscript takes its name from the Abbey of Kells. That was its home for many centuries, but today you can actually see it because it's on permanent display at Trinity College in the library in Dublin. The library usually displays two of the current 4 volumes at one time, one showing a major illustration and the other showing typical text pages. And just as a side note, if you go to Marquette into their special library area and meet with the special librarian, there actually is a very faithfully reproduced copy of the Book of Kells there in their library to size, which is really quite beautiful. So the manuscript is comprised of 340 folios, and in 1953, all the 4 volumes were bound together. The leaves are high quality calfskin and unprecedented elaborate ornamentation. There are 10 full page illustrations and text pages that are vibrant with historical initials and interlinear miniatures and marks of the furthest extension of anti-classical and energetic qualities of insular art. And when I say anti-classical, what I'm talking about is that pagan Celtic drawing that we see throughout the book. The insular majuscule script of the text itself appears to be the work of at least 3 different monks. The lettering is in iron gall ink, which is a particular type of ink, and the colors that were used were brought in from pigments from pretty much all over. They were imported in order to make all these vibrant colors, these reds and greens and blues and so on. And so we know, like, for example, like in to make the blue, they would have to grind actual lapis lazuli stone, so they came from all different kinds of substances. So I'm just going to kind of go through a few of the pages. Sorry, some of the digital images I have aren't the greatest, but you can definitely go online and you can see these in great detail. I highly encourage you to look up the Book of Kells and take a look at some of the beautiful illustrations that are available. And here we can see a different style. And that brings us to the end of this particular presentation on handmade manuscripts. And I hope that it informed you a little bit more about why they're important and how they kind of were the beginnings of illustrated design.